Well, thank you. That was very optimistic. We do have our work cut out for us. Have a few minutes for some questions. Go ahead. I'm going to repeat the question. This is a question about the effect of term limits on.
Yes, they've made an enormous difference. In short, they've empowered lobbyists. They have reduced respect for the institution itself. They have reduced respect for staff. They have resulted in very few long-term staff with institutional memory. About the only place any of that is left in most states with term limits is in the fiscal committees. You find that your chairs don't know how to run committees. It's very difficult to control the floor because there's no respect for the rules in the institution. And there's very, very little concern these days, vis-a-vis when I started, with long-term policy. These guys come in knowing they have X number of years, and it's the average term is fewer than 8, okay, the average length of service. And they're not interested in anything that doesn't facilitate their short-term goal and their immediate political objectives.
Yes?
No, it's a good question.
Let me repeat the question. Question was raised about the continuing influence of the Education Commission of the States, which was designed, a state compact about 35 years ago, to bring state policymakers and state education leaders together.
Thank you. No, I appreciate the question because in the interest of time, I mentioned, I just referred to one national policy organization, the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education, but clearly there are others. ECS is one that, as you mentioned, has a long-standing influence. I mentioned Complete College America. David Brenneman mentioned NCHEMS and other organizations. SHIO is another organization. So I think these are all part of this type of intermediary organizations. In the 3 states that I interviewed folks, though, ECS did not rise to the top as one in which they relied on for information or consulting.
Yes? A question was raised about, I believe the recent, was a State Board of Education adoption of a policy to over time, reduce, if not totally eliminate, the use of textbooks and being replaced with the digital instructional materials.
The short answer is no, ma'am, I can't. That's not a piece of policy that I'm intimately familiar with. I'm sorry.
Is there anything about the current climate in the legislature that might?
Yeah, I would say find the lobbyists. It's very seldom a what. It's almost always a who.
There's a question about the influence of independent think tanks and their information. Yeah. Yeah. How do people in education come back when the research, in fact, gives very differing conclusions?
You know, one thing that Dr. Brenneman and Dr. Ness both touched on this a little bit was the development of these state-level coordinating boards. Early on, their development was largely driven by the federal government and the Higher Education Act, the original Higher Education Act, which drove out all sorts of federal money into the hands of students and institutions. And the federal government saw a role for the states in bringing some planning, some management, and some oversight. If they were going to give them all this money, they wanted it to be used well. And the history of the boards were such that originally they were staffed quite well, had a high degree of analytical capacity, and could do, among many other things, two things. Do their own analysis in-house, but also serve as kind of and the words escape me, but a kind of a clearinghouse function where they could look at the research, make a determination of its quality, and hopefully inform policy. That's in an ideal world. But I know Paul Lingenfelter at SHIO and others, and I don't know if Dr. Brenneman would fall into this category, but are really concerned about the analytical capacity of our state-level governing and coordinating boards, and whether they can actually fill that role to whatever degree they used to. The determination of what research to pay attention to is a huge problem. And you look at the political campaign that we're in, and each one's throwing, oh, I saw a study, well, I saw a study. Making a determination of its source, its analytical rigor, and things like that. Those things can be done, but whether we have the people to do it and to assist the policymakers in making those determinations, across the country, I'd have serious doubts as to whether we do. Perhaps some states do it better than others, but you've identified a very good problem. I'm sure others have more to say on it.
Well, just a brief follow-up would be another place where research capacity exists, I think, in some states is within the legislature, and what varies widely. I'm not familiar with Florida's system, but that often have these nonpartisan research offices. In Kansas, I mentioned what I highlighted in my remarks earlier was that there were some legislators who seemed to be utilizing and motivated by some of the reports coming from a more conservative-leaning Kansas Policy Institute, and more broadly by ALEC and some other organizations. And what respondents said is that they have the Kansas Legislative Research Department that served, as their words, as the honest broker, and that truly was it was perceived as being nonpartisan. And that legislators would take these reports and say, I just saw this, I'm inclined to agree with it, but I just want to have you tell me what you think about it. And from the perspective of folks there, it did have somewhat of a balancing effect of information that is clearly designed to advocate for a particular perspective. There's been national studies done that suggest that a lot of states do have this capacity within the legislature, but I know it varies widely, and that study is now 10 or 15 years dated, and maybe the political winds have surely they've shifted some in that time. Term limits.
Any other questions? Marcy. I will try, and I will summarize it. Dean Driscoll asked about noted concerns that she's come across, and where the idea of research and its quality seems to be somewhat almost negotiable. And in fact, how do elected officials think about research, and how they distinguish between quality information and information that may be less rigorous?
Well, I think, I don't know about that flexibility comment, but I think there is more and more a tendency to cherry pick what they want to look at. Rather than doing a thorough analysis of what's out there, they're going to go to certain sources or people that are going to support what they want, and that's what they're going to read, that's what they're going to cite, and that's what they're going to draft legislation based on. I mean, ALEC has been, and is a classic example, very, very successful at spreading certain research nationwide and getting it into legislation. Extremely successful.
I might add that that not only are they spreading research, but they have draft legislation available, right? And so it makes it really, really easy on legislators who are inclined to agree with that perspective to have the bill very.
Yeah, they don't mess around. They got great parties too.
Well, and Carolyn, the second half of her question was, do we have a honest broker in Florida? And we did have that legislative research office. I forget what it was.
OPAGA?
OPAGA, but I understand that's been largely defunded, right?
No, OPAGA lost about 40% of its.
40%. Okay.
Would you describe what it is and where it's situated, David?
It is a joint research bureau, a policy research bureau in the legislature. The legislature also houses the state auditor general, which does the fiscal audits. OPAGA grew out of a program auditing unit in the auditor general, and does a lot of the policy analysis and program evaluation work for the legislature for both houses.
So it's an in-house
Yes.
research capacity, and which what's about 15, 20 years old. And since you, at least my perception, I see that there's kind of a flourishing of different units. Now, a State Department will have its research unit. The legislature has its own research unit. Individual legislators, of course, will have their staff. And mention about think tanks and the proliferation thereof, I believe I read where there's 1,000 of them now in the greater Washington, D.C. area. And so when you talk about cherry picking, obviously it becomes easier to cherry pick when you have this huge supply out there to cherry pick from. So it's become much more, in my estimation, the environment has become much more fluid, and in some ways it's flourishing. There are a lot of people with a lot of good ideas and not so good ideas, and it's getting easier to find means of putting information out. And the sifting through, the qualifying of that information is correspondingly more difficult. Well, are we full of questions or full of hunger? We're flexible here. One more question, then maybe we'll address the second human need.
I guess my question is sort of related to state legislators, and over the course of the last decade or even longer, there's been an increase in specialization and professionalization of state legislators. So legislators serving for longer and also serving on specialized committees. Do you think that that's been a boon or a hindrance to sort of ensuring that good policy is written for higher education?
Take a first crack at it.
Eric, would you repeat the question?
Sure. The question was, to what extent the increasing professionalization of legislators and specialization of legislators on specific policy issues has impacted the utilization of research and other policymaking activity. And I think, without respect to term, I suspect that term limits have a severe would constrain that trend by quite a bit. So in states that don't have term limits, I would say that I suspect that it really hinges on the members that persist and the members that are in those legislative positions. I think there's some structural issues within legislatures that may facilitate a greater influence, for example, of a chair of a particular committee or of a body, the Senate pro tem or the Speaker of the House. I think the other thing, it relates though to a broader trend that may be more pronounced now. I don't know whether I agree with the premise or not. I just don't know. But I think the idea is long-standing, that legislators in fact do focus on specific issues. They can't become experts in everything. And I had in an earlier study on the adoption of these merit scholarship programs, similar to the Bright Futures here in Florida, an interview with former Governor Wise in West Virginia, he described, gave the parallel of being for his perspective in the U.S. Congress, was kind of like being in college as an undergraduate, and if you had a test in economics, you would go down the hall and find the economics major and ask her to perhaps give you some insight on the material. And he said the same thing happens in legislatures. He was talking about his experience in the U.S. Congress, but also in state houses, that members, the most preferred source of information from a few studies that I'm familiar with, of members of legislatures is other legislators. And so if they find legislators that agree generally with their perspective, and then kind of defer to them on a particular, whether it's energy or education or transportation or whatever the policy idea, I think that could have a significant influence, and is one that has been written about, going back further decades as being relevant in the policymaking process.
I would add a few things to that. So first, it may be helpful to provide a definition of what generally legislative professionalism means. A professional legislature is one that's usually in session longer. Legislators are generally paid more, have greater staff resources. In other words, the state legislature more resembles Congress. Okay. And so this has been studied in political science and more recently within the higher education literature. So what effect does having a more professionalized legislature have on public policy for higher education? And we get some rather consistent findings that more professional legislatures generally are more generous to higher education. So you see increased funding as professionalism increases. Also, professional legislatures tend to be more innovative in their higher education policies. They'll adopt more innovative financing solutions, financial aid, governance solutions, things like that. And so clearly, having a legislature that sees themselves as a more full-time job, a professional job, alters the way that they act and think about things, right? The opposite being a citizen legislature where you show up for a couple weeks, once a year or maybe every 2 years, pass some legislation or not, and then go back to your full-time job. Whereas the trend, especially in the larger states, has been towards legislators seeing it as their full-time year-round job. And that can be good or bad, right? They devote more time and attention to it, but at the same time, there's as I experienced in Pennsylvania, opportunity for some rather negative outcomes too when legislators see it as their full-time job and are devoting all their waking hours to that job. But all of that said, it clearly impacts policymaking when you're in the presence of a professional legislature versus a more citizen legislature, whereas Florida kind of falls in the middle, which is interesting.
David, do you want to add anything to that, David Coburn? No. Well, on that note, why don't we break for lunch? Lunch is being served in the alcove right to my right, and come back here and eat, and then the program will start up again in about an hour. Join me in thanking the panel.
So we're pleased to welcome Dr. Michael McClendon to our midst. Dr. McClendon, he's a professor of higher education policy and leadership, and also the associate dean within the college, the Simmons School of Education and Human Development at Southern Methodist University. Previous to that, he was professor of public policy and higher education and also an executive associate dean at the Peabody College at Vanderbilt University. It's not often that a scholar comes along that through his and his collaborators' work are able to open essentially a brand new line of research within an established body of research. But that's exactly what Dr. McClendon did about beginning 13 years ago and continuing to this day. There had been a trend and a history within the higher education policy research area where researchers would focus on the effect of policies on various outcomes, and so the effect of a financial aid program on how it impacted access and perhaps retention and graduation rates. But little to no attention was paid on why, in fact, that policy was adopted in the first place, and the factors, the political factors and the political environment that may increase the likelihood that a state, for example, would adopt a merit aid, financial aid program, for example. Dr. McClendon, though, has spent the last 13 years examining the political antecedents of policy and finance decisions, helping us to understand how the political environments of states may result in a policy being adopted or ignored, how state support for higher education may increase or decrease, which has greatly increased our understanding of the dynamic political environment that our higher education policy decisions are made in. And so with that, I'm happy to turn the time over to Dr. McClendon, but first would like to note what an incredible impact he's had on my professional career. It was his research that inspired me when I was a young master's student in higher education to abandon my original trajectory, get a master's in political science, and now here I am today, guided all along through his mentorship and guidance and friendship. So it's a real privilege to welcome Dr. McClendon to the podium.
Thank you, David. It's, well, that's one of the warmest introductions I've ever had, and I appreciate it very much. I'll say a little bit more about David and about some of your other colleagues here in just a moment. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm sorry I'm running about 15 minutes late. As it turns out, I did make it despite American Airlines' best intentions. I was grounded last evening in Dallas, Fort Worth, somewhere in Dante's Hells. That would be one of those levels. And then again, a 2-hour delay this morning out of Miami. So I have the twin challenges of beginning my address a little bit behind the clock, and at the same time also taking on a topic that is so vast and complex and that really spans the entire course of American higher education. And I think today, accountability, the topic that I've chosen to speak on today, is one of the most important topics in American public policy as it relates to higher education. So with all of that said, I want to say just a brief note also of appreciation to Dean Driscoll. Marcy, thank you very much for the invitation. To you and your colleagues, particularly my dear esteemed colleagues, Carolyn Harrington and David Tanberg, Toby Park, and others here on your faculty. I want to say just David, this is impossible, but I'm going to say just a brief note of color, if I may, that I don't know if my colleagues here, our colleagues here today, know that I was here. And Carolyn, I'm not going to, I worked for Carolyn for years, so I'm not going to indicate, in fact, how long ago it was. But I was here as a student, a master's student at Florida State, at least 3, 4, 5 years ago. And they were two of the most formative years that, of my professional career. I was not long out of my undergraduate work. I was struggling, wrestling to put together my mutual interest in public policy and politics, public finance and governance of higher education. And I had the pleasure, indeed the honor, to take my master's degree here at a time when policy studies were beginning to burgeon in the K-12 education field and in the higher education field. And I also had the opportunity to work on the House of Representatives, Florida House of Representatives Higher Education Committee during my several years here. And so it's a real honor to be back with you here today. And indeed, for me and my career, much of it began here on this campus 20 years ago, Carolyn. I've been asked to speak a little bit about matters of accountability in U.S. higher education. And as I mentioned, it's such a daunting and a vast area. And indeed, it's important for a number of reasons. One of those is that the concepts and the practices of accountability, particularly state accountability in the area of higher education, are and have been undergoing substantial change, as you know. Today, questions around accountability, I believe, are among the very most important and consequential of the public policy questions that the public policymakers, elected officials, and public institutions of higher education are asking. And I think there is a sea change underway in the way in which our nation, our systems of higher education, our elected officials, our political institutions, and our public think about higher education as a concept, and a sea change underway in the manner in which we're expecting our public higher education institutions, in particular, to be accountable to the public. I'd like to do several things here just in the few moments that I have. And as I have it written here before me, this could well last into next week. So I'm going to seriously abridge this as I move here in the next 20 to 30 minutes. Let me do several things. One is I'd like to provide just a little bit of a historical context for accountability in higher education, because the manner in which we understand it, the appreciation of the historical context in which our particularistic accountability mechanisms and frameworks in public higher education in this country have arisen over time, defines and determines to a great extent our answer to the question, to whom is accountable and how should that accountability be determined. So I'd like to talk for just a moment about that. Second, I'd like to talk a bit about the recent shift, as we all know, the recent shift to an altogether new kind of accountability, performance-based outcomes and performance-based accountability, one of the important innovations in reforms in public policy for higher education over the past 25 years. And third, let me finally mention some emerging challenges, some policy surprises, indeed some important implications of these newer accountability pressures. And I'm going to simultaneously demonstrate my sophisticated handling of this, and a little bit of a wobbly podium. I'm not of inconsequential size, and I move a lot as I speak, so I think it's very likely this may, hopefully not metaphorically, but literally we may all come down together here in the next few minutes. So let me say just a few words about accountability in public higher education. It is, as we all know, a terrain that is venerable as well as contested. I'd like to mention to you and ask you to think with me on a different way to frame accountability. Today, so much of our accountability dialogue really is around discrete programs or policies, a particular accountability schema. But accountability also, in the best sense, I think the most accurate historical sense and the truest sense, is also a relationship. And we can think of accountability as a relationship in addition to that as a discrete program or policy. We can think about accountability in higher education as a kind of principal-agent relationship, and a classic problem in principal-agent relations. Accountability in higher education is a tri-cornered relationship, I would assert, in which we have a citizenry who elects public officials. We have those public officials who act in behalf of the public's interest, presumably. And we have the agency officials who are then appointed by the elected officials to implement the policies or the policy regimes that are enacted. And while this is an optimistic view of a well-functioning democracy, there will always be a perennial conflict because at the heart of higher education accountability are questions such as how much authority and of what kind can and should be delegated to public agency leaders such as campus presidents or system heads. And at the same time, at what costs do we do this in terms of monitoring and control? What are the trade-offs between independence and delegation on the one hand and control and monitoring on the other to ensure the public's interest? Historically, higher education accountability practices in the American states have been shaped by a highly decentralized federal governmental system. Higher education, just like education, found nowhere in the Constitution. And our states over time have functioned as, in the best sense of the term, laboratories of democracy, both in terms of the governance, the finance, and indeed the accountability policies or frameworks that states have enacted and pursued over time. We see 50 different state systems, not a single national superordinate system. And until recently, a matter on which I'll come back in just a few moments, we haven't really had a predominant sort of accountability regime that stretched across any particular large number of states. And yet distinct patterns, accountability patterns, have existed over time. These patterns have been shaped and reshaped over the years in subsequent waves of change, innovation, and reform, what many of us have talked about in the literature and what many study and understand to be governance reform or accountability reform in higher education. Let me suggest at the risk also of simplifying this very complex terrain that there have been a series of accountability eras in American higher education. In the modern history of public higher education, I see at least four. In the pre-1950s, this was a period of the era of professional authority and idiosyncratic state governmental intervention. There was, up until the late 1950s, really not a systematic, coordinated effort to govern and coordinate higher education at a state level, except for a few states. Florida was one of those, and a few western states. And it was at the same time, however, also an era in which idiosyncratic governmental intervention occurred, mainly through the kinds of interventions through governor's offices and legislatures that, in fact, in the 1960s led to a new era of accountability in higher education, an era in which the states began to think about new models and systematic ways of governing, coordinating, and organizing higher education at scale, en masse, so that our higher education policies would not be prone to the sort of idiosyncratic intervention by whoever happened to be elected at a given moment in time. The 1950s to 70s I would characterize as an era of growth in public bureaucracy and of increasingly standardized state control. We saw the emergence during this era of the coordinating board, an altogether innovative practice in American higher education that really did not exist prior to the late 1950s, early 1960s. The coordinating board model was understood to be a way to keep higher education accountable by having a single board that would advise governors and legislatures as to a rational course of action and policy action for higher education that would somehow be beyond the idiosyncratic interest of individual systems or campuses. And then, of course, we had also during this time the continued, if slowed, growth of multi-campus systems and of consolidated governing boards, not unlike the one that Florida had in this state, and famously so for many decades. That period, this second period, gave way in the 1980s to what some of us have called the era of governance restructuring in higher education. And what these three, and let me just back up a moment to share with you some aspects of this era of governance restructuring beginning in the 1980s and really coming to a full head in the 1990s, because it represented and conveyed themes that had not been seen in the previous era. Although we see during this time a pattern of mixed movement in terms of the accountability pendulum in higher education, who has control over the campus, should the campus have it, should the state have it, there's a mixed pattern of state activity during this era, and yet it contained noteworthy elements, themes of decentralization, devolution, and deregulation. And since the mid-1980s, we've seen incredibly in the states something on the order of about 300 initiatives to modify states' higher education governance arrangements. It's a remarkable number of initiatives and measures, of course not all of those enacted. But this period came at the same time as America was undergoing at least three important developments. One, deregulation swept many American industries and sectors. Second, there was the devolution revolution underway at the U.S. federal level. And third, there was, as our own President Bill Clinton once declared famously from the well of the House, the era of big government was over. And so it was thought in the 1980s and 90s that we needed new ways of holding higher education accountable. And the best way to do that would be to make higher education systems and campuses more market smart by decentralizing control over such things as as you know here in Florida better than others, questions of tuition setting and fee setting, of the hiring and firing of campus presidents, programmatic control, what kinds of academic programs could be established and under what conditions could they be terminated. These key aspects of leadership, funding and finance, and academic authority began to move away from states' coordinating boards and governing boards and closer to campuses during this era. Just very briefly, I think one of the most interesting aspects or examples of this movement during this era was the case of New Jersey, which in 1994 abolished one of the nation's most powerful coordinating boards, the New Jersey Higher Education Coordinating Board, and delegated the agency's powers over those academic programs and indeed institutional budgets to the formerly regulated campuses. We had different kinds of decentralization initiatives underway in Oregon and in Hawaii, sometimes using the language of redesignating public universities or systems as quasi-public campuses. And we've had other kinds of initiatives in Arkansas, South Carolina, and a number of other states. Of course, there's also the very curious, interesting, and famous case of Florida, a state that, not in 1 year, as suggested by the previous examples, but over the course of almost a decade, has continued to make sense of an initiative that simultaneously centralized authority in some respects by creating a P20 board to aim toward seamlessness, increased seamlessness, less seamfulness between the K-12 and higher education systems, while at the same time decentralizing or deregulating certain aspects to institutions, namely in the creation of institutional governing boards with certain authorities that simply didn't exist at the campus level. So Florida is an example of states that defied a general trend in the 80s and 90s toward clear decentralizing, deregulating, devolving kinds of initiatives. But in the late 1990s, we happen upon an altogether different era, and this is where I'd like to spend just a couple of moments focusing our attention. The era of performance accountability and of privatization. Let me put parenthetically, I think I come back to it later, talk of privatization. There is a great deal of talk about privatization, privatizing public higher education in a number of states. There is this talk. To date, there's not a lot of activity, but it is certainly a controversial notion. I know of nowhere in the country in which privatization is being discussed as a change in ownership form, which is what's required to privatize, truly privatize something. On the other hand, the kinds of changes that are being suggested, and mainly on behalf of the idea that we need to do something radically different in public higher education to hold it more accountable to the public. These are fairly radical notions compared to, it's not a value judgment, descriptively, empirically, factually. These are fairly radical notions compared to the ideas that governed our the building and the growth of our public higher education systems during the so-called golden era of higher education expansion during the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. So let me say a little bit about performance accountability. David Tanberg, where are you? Thank you, David. Thank you. Did you all, Professor Brenneman, I said hello to 15 seconds as I walked in the building. He was off to the airport. Did you all talk a great deal this morning already about matters of performance accountability or performance funding?
We've talked about it to a certain extent. I wouldn't say a great deal.
That doesn't help me, David. I was hoping you would say, McClendon, we've already talked about that completely, utterly, and you can cut out the next 15 minutes. I'm mindful of time, I'm mindful of time. Let me suggest that there are a number of forces reshaping both the concept and practice of higher education accountability, and these fall in two general bins. These are moving the system much more toward our systems, our 50-state systems, and our national and state rhetoric, our dialogue around what it means to be accountable and what forms accountability takes. These forces, I would argue, assert, are moving us in a direction that we've not really moved in before. And there are two sets of forces, as I see them. David, Eric Ness, Toby, and others might see them in slightly different ways, but let me refer to them as a ubiquitously reported set of forces. And then in just a moment, let me mention an underreported set of forces. So you've talked, and you are at the epicenter of important changes in the American states in terms of reduced state funding effort for higher education. And I should say more broadly than that, questions over what is the appropriate role and what is the appropriate level of state funding of higher education in what is becoming a new normal of diminished state capacity and perhaps will to fund a variety of different public agencies and public services. On this point, and I have a variety of things I would like to show, but I won't. On this point, let me just say that the emphasis here is on reduced state funding effort. Some of you might say, but Michael, aren't the states spending more today, or at least last year, than they have been at any other time in American history? And that's accurate. But they're spending less relative to state wealth, their per capita income, that is. They're spending less than they used to relative to state budgets, that is to say capacity to fund. And they're spending less relative to full-time enrollment students on American campuses. And of course, the great wrestle, the great struggle, the great conflict in public higher education nationwide is how does a sector that is having more and more accountability pressures placed upon it able to maintain quality, to increase access, to do those things with less resources at a time in which enrollments, until just the announcement the other day, it appears enrollments have been surging over the past decade. It's a problem that higher education has never before faced in this country, and it's a problem that is reshaping the notion of what it means to be accountable. So we have this reduced state funding effort, which are driving questions by state legislators everywhere in the country over how can higher education do what it has been doing, and frankly now asking the additional questions, how can it do what it's been doing but do it even better? And by the way, how can you do it and do it better, and perhaps even do newer things, and do it with less public resources than one had before? And by the way, if you could please do that and not raise tuition levels, that would additionally be helpful politically and otherwise. So this is a real vice in which higher education in every state across the country finds itself. And of course, there are policy conditions within higher education, some of which I just mentioned. Here are some underreported forces reshaping accountability in public higher education. I did what speakers should never do, which is that I think David may have assumed I would talk about one thing, and I'm talking about something completely different. Here's what much of my research and scholarship over the years has focused on is this one slide. I wanted to place a different emphasis on our discussion today, however, and talk about some broader trends and implications. But there are broader forces that are reshaping public policy for higher education in the 50 American states. We see these historic shifts in the financing profile of campuses. Now, 20 years ago, and you all may have mentioned, talked about this already, 20 years ago, there were, closer to 25 years ago, there were 2 universities in the country in which the state's share of total institutional resources was less than 20%. Only one in which it was less than 10%, right around 10, 11%, is the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Today, there are more than 80 public colleges and universities in the nation that have less than 20% of their total educational revenue, of their total budget rather, that comes from state sources. And by some of our more recent projections, within the next 3 to 4 years, if current trends hold, there may well be over 150 institutions in the country for which this is the case. This is a rather dramatic moment in higher education when the state is no longer the primary financial stakeholder in public higher education. One might reasonably ask, what is distinctly public about public higher education? Of course, there are other good answers to that question, but public funding has always been one of the fundaments of a state-owned public system of higher education, and that model is disappearing. In fact, I would argue that we've inherited this notion that since the Dartmouth decision, 1819, American higher education has been distinctive in the fact that there are 2 main sectors of higher education, one distinctly public, one distinctly private. And I would argue that on the horizon we see the emergence of a third, historically a really important moment, a third sector of higher education, one that is quasi-public in terms of its financing. And that has vast implications, both the ways in which we fund and govern our institutions of higher education and the manner in which we hold them accountable, as I'll mention in just a few moments. We've also seen state leadership changes and the fraying of the industry's fragile political support, term limits in many states such as Michigan and others, the rise of of Republicans in many states that have had different policy agendas than Democrats that were tied to older institutional agendas, some would argue. Simply change in political leadership in states in a variety of ways. And also, what I might argue is higher education, like K-12 education, finally having developed into something that matters so importantly that entrepreneurial governors and legislators are now moving toward it as a subject of debate in the way in which they did K-12 education 25 to 30 years ago. Higher education has become high politics, not low politics. For these reasons, as well as I say, the success of the accountability movement in K-12 education, I don't mean that as rendering a policy judgment, but rather many of those who have argued for reconsideration of the way in which we think about accountability in American K-12 education have argued that a really essential component is rethinking the role of the state vis-a-vis the professional educator. And as one dear friend of mine and leader in this movement 25, 30 years ago said to me at one point, Michael, you know, public accountability in American education is simply too important to be left to professional educators. It needs to be done from outside the system. And there may well be some truth to that, but the fact is that this notion has also come to higher education, in which we no longer as a public necessarily expect or assume that institutions or faculty will make the right decisions for students or for states, but rather we need external regulation and control in a way in which we didn't have in many states a generation earlier. So, shifting now briefly to newer accountability initiatives in public higher education. As a result of these forces, financial, political, economic in some ways, public opinion forces, structural shifts in the American economy, problems with state budgets and budget capacity in waves that we've not before faced, as well as a now increasing line of criticism about the follies and the problems of higher education overall, not just public but also private. We've seen as a result of those forces the emergence of new kinds of accountability in public higher education. And let me just for a moment speak about several of these. One, outcomes-based performance funding programs, what increasingly we are calling performance funding 1.0. And then second, performance funding programs based on indicators of intermediate achievement. That is to say, not based on indicators that are outcome-oriented alone, but rather focusing on the throughput of the system. Programs of a kind that we've begun to call performance funding 2.0. How many of you are well familiar with performance funding 2.0 models or systems? I expected this table to be, and they are. Third, let me say just a word about charter colleges and enterprise universities, and then finally just a word about privatization. What was different in the 1980s and 1990s was that states began thinking about accountability not in terms of a structural framework, like the ways in which a state does its governance system or how it coordinates across institutional interests. States began thinking in terms not necessarily structurally, but in terms of outcomes of higher education. This, I think, influenced substantially by the movement underway in K-12 education at that time. And public higher education began increasingly to be asked to be accountable for that which it produced, its students, notably. And the rhetoric of this new accountability movement has called for a refocusing of attention on the outcomes of campus activities. An effort, therefore, on the part of legislators and states and governors in an era of constrained and scarce public resources to say, how do we make tougher choices about the allocation of scarcer and scarcer resources when all institutions of higher education claim they are doing what's in the public self-interest, and yet, frankly, it's not clear how they're demonstrating that the manner in which they convert inputs into outputs is necessarily producing good outcomes for states. Performance Funding 1.0, the first version of this initiative, began really in Tennessee in 1979, the nation's first performance accountability program. But it wasn't until a number of years later that it began to spread nationally. These performance funding programs are ones, you'll recall, that reward institutions for demonstrated performance on select indicators or metrics, such as graduation rates or diversity indicators of a campus community, or other kinds of things that institutions would be held accountable for. As late as 1990, there were only 2 states in the country that had a statewide performance funding framework. But by 2002, there were 25 states in the country, and we began talking a great deal in American higher education around the importance of accountability to be demonstrated by institutions' performance in predetermined, specified ways. The state and institutions would negotiate how institutions would demonstrate their performance, and some money would be held aside to reward institutions that fared better than others. It's important to add that all of these programs that existed as of 2002, and by the way, if you move forward 5 more years, 2007, there's 1 more state. So essentially by the early 2000 period between 1990 and 2000, 2002, there was a wave of performance funding policy adoption. And the notion was that in exchange for a campus having performed in such a manner, it would receive some money. In the late 2000 period, mid-2000 period, it became clear to many states that the financial incentives simply weren't enough. There was really no evidence of which I'm familiar that, others will correct me, that, except David, I look at you and I think about the state of Pennsylvania, where you were, and you were involved in that system. I think performance funding in Pennsylvania, as I recall, these are associations obviously, but during that period, was there not a substantial increase in Hispanic student retention and also in college completion in that state, in the Commonwealth? So, in most other states, there's not very strong evidence, and frankly, there's not any empirical evidence that performance accountability systems had really done much to turn the needle, to bend the needle in terms of the kinds of outcomes or outputs that state governments wanted. And probably the reason for that, states across the nation agreed, was that the incentives that were at stake were simply too small. The average national performance funding extra pot of money that had been held out for institutions to comply with things like degree attainment, or rather degree production, student retention measures, diversity measures on campus, things of that nature, the average nationally was 4.4% of an institution's budget. So this is very incremental and small amounts of money that probably were not going to change institutional behavior very much. Thus, the arrival just a few years ago of something that some states and analysts have begun calling performance funding 2.0. In fact, this is probably a misnomer, because the old performance funding system, which held some pot of money out in exchange for an institution demonstrating compliance with some pre-specified outcome or indicator of performance, that kind of system is very different than the performance funding 2.0 system. These newer systems are ones that actually have gone back to revise the enrollment-driven funding formulas that helped create our systems of public higher education and fund them in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. These new performance funding models really do pretty dramatic things. They often address throughput by placing considerable emphasis on indicators of this intermediate achievement, such as on the percentage of students that complete certain courses, gateway courses, for example. These programs also tend to be embedded in a state's base funding formula rather than being used as an add-on or a bonus. And noteworthy examples here, I place Tennessee and Ohio next to one another, and I think, frankly, our colleagues in Tennessee would be upset by this. Tennessee has done something that's really pretty remarkable. It hasn't simply, as Ohio has done, begin to reward I think the amount of money at stake for institutions in Ohio is something like about 15%, 20% of an institution's total state budget. In Tennessee today, it's 80%. So 80% of the money that is going to public institutions in Tennessee, both community colleges, four-year public institutions, public research universities, 80% of the state allocation is being based on institutional performance. Tennessee has initiated the most comprehensive and robust of these new performance-based funding systems to date. I mentioned that Tennessee has about 80% of its total state funding to be allocated on the basis of performance. And performance is based on a couple of key things in Tennessee. It's based on student retention, degree attainment, and completion of remedial courses, in addition to some other key measures. The state also incorporates about a 40% premium in its funding formula for adults and students receiving Pell Grants. So one of the problems in Tennessee is an uneducated, relatively uneducated adult population. They have factored that into the new formula funding model. And the elegance of the new Tennessee funding model based upon performance, institutional performance, is found in the ways in which it weights various factors for different types of institutions, that is, institutions that have different kinds of missions. It doesn't, as many performance accountability systems do, presume that public research universities ought to be in the same business or are in the same business as community colleges, or non-selective open access four-year institutions. And by pegging certain kinds of weights to certain anticipated outcomes at different types of Carnegie institutions in the states, Tennessee, in my estimation, has been able to put real teeth into performance-based funding, and at the same time help retain some of the clear distinctions between and among different types of institutions in that state. I think I will, for the sake of time, probably say little about charter colleges other than Professor Brenneman and others probably could have spoken to the charter college, and perhaps he did, movement in Virginia, which did a fairly remarkable thing. In negotiation with the state and the governor, Mark Warner at the time, and the legislature, the three large, most prestigious universities in Virginia, University of Virginia, Virginia Tech, and College of William and Mary, struck a new agreement with the state that in exchange for reduced state funding and reduced state asking, public universities would be set free from a great many regulatory requirements that pertain to other institutions. In addition, they would also gain control over their tuition setting. This has been a model by which a number of states elsewhere have reconsidered what it means for an institution to be accountable. Perhaps some states have wondered what we ought to do is get out of the business of funding public higher education, require public institutions to raise more of their own auxiliary revenue, free them up to pursue new market kinds of distinction, to be more market smart in terms of how institutions behave, free them, public institutions, from certain kinds of regulatory requirements that are bureaucratic and impose certain kinds of reduced efficiencies and higher costs. But in exchange for that, require the public university to sign an agreement as to what its outcomes will be at a 5-year, 10-year, or perhaps a point in time even farther downstream than that. So a very different way in which some states, not only Virginia but others, have begun to ask the question, how do we properly structure and negotiate the right kind of accountability agreement with our public colleges and universities? It follows in this vein that if we are, some states, considering perhaps reducing state subsidies to public colleges and universities substantially, perhaps maybe we should also think about reducing it entirely, or perhaps no longer providing a base of support directly to the institution, particularly if we don't really trust large public bureaucracies, and instead empowering students to make choices in the private marketplace of higher education goods and services by reallocating that institutional subsidy and giving it directly to students to use. This was something Colorado did with its college voucher program in 2005. Its aims were to increase interinstitutional competition, lower prices, improve efficiencies, and increase quality. In reality, when that state's economy floundered just a year or two later, the value of the voucher that students had been promised in the legislation was cut from $4,000 down to just $2,400. Tuition at 2-year and 4-year institutions skyrocketed, as you can imagine. Enrollments in higher education fell, and underrepresented populations became less likely to enroll in colleges in the state. There are today in Texas, my home state now, as of 2 months ago, and in a number of other states as well, at least rhetoric and talk around the advantages of vouchers, of privatization of public higher education. It's clear that something dramatic is happening in public higher education, and it has been for several decades. The state is, and I think is on a long-run trajectory to become, in most states, no longer the primary financial stakeholder, at least for four-year colleges and universities. But there's a pretty substantial divide between reduced and perhaps even very minimal, even trivial public subsidy for higher education and the idea of privatizing public higher education altogether. And yet that rhetoric, that talk of privatization is very powerful and in fact has begun to help drive public policy for higher education in the state of Texas, which we can talk perhaps more about if we have a moment. Let me, and thank you for your patience. For the sake of time, I've moved pretty quickly. I'm happy either now or at some point later or privately to talk about any of these matters with you. But let me move here very briefly to some concluding comments. Emerging challenges, implications, and concerns. Without fully recognizing it, I think, the narrative around accountability for higher education in the American states has shifted in a fairly short period of time. We used to think about not only the rhetoric, but also the reality. We used to think about a pendulum of campus state control, right? And the question that we asked in order to help render our public systems more accountable to the public was, where do we set the line between campus autonomy on the one hand and state-level control or authority on the other? And one could go down a whole list of things such as tuition control or the hiring and firing of presidents or control over faculty lines or personnel matters or purchasing or the right of institutions, the ability of institutions under statute to be able to retain their own attorneys, what to do with public lands, auxiliary fees. I mean, in many of these things, the question always was, what's the proper delineation? Where precisely should the line be placed between campus autonomy and state authority? And this notion was very popular, in fact, pervasive in the way we thought about and we practiced accountability in this country. I would argue that today we have moved beyond that notion. In many states, we really don't talk about this idea of a republic of scholars on the one hand and external regulatory states on the other. Something dramatic and I think profound has emerged, and it is the idea of sort of state steering and the compass of state steering. We don't speak about a pendulum that flows between absolute independence or absolute external state control. We're now talking about states and institutions working together. This is a happy version, optimistic version. States and campuses working together in which the state agrees to head in a direction, and that direction might be increased college attainment. And where is this not an important direction of any state? And then the question is, how then do we configure some of these funding and accountability arrangements in such a way that campuses help the state meet that important overriding public end? And this is a really important development in the way we think about accountability in the American states. At the same time, state policy systemness has been supplanting institutional centrism. The National Center on Higher Education Management Systems had a nice little phrasing years ago that the sum of institutional self-interest does not equate with good public policy. And I like that. I like it. But on the other hand, I'd retort that a too narrow focus on one construction of accountability or even a performance accountability can render the institutions fully incapable of doing what they need to do in order to serve the legitimate public interest. There's no question that the way in which we talk about accountability has shifted over the past couple of years, and I think over the past decade or so. Policy systemness has now begun to supplant the idea of individual institutions in a hyper-competitive marketplace for resources and prestige. The era of single-minded institutional pursuit of higher rankings, I think clearly is over. It's an important element in the survival of any institution, in the self-awareness of any institution, the manner in which it chooses to deploy its resources. But the reality is that the conversation has moved to a much larger scale now. It's not what can the state provide institutions to pursue whatever their goals may be. Rather, it is how do institutions serve the larger public good in serving a system orientation or a policy orientation of a state, usually oriented around human capital development. Third, the rise of learning accountability. David, am I more than a half hour off in my allotted time? Third, the rise of learning accountability. I am told that David Brenneman this morning mentioned to you his work and the ongoing work of the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education and the report cards first issued in the early 2000 period. They did a masterful thing, I think, in the 2006 report cards, which was for the first time. This is the first mechanism by which legislators or governors ever were confronted by an outside group coming in to tell them how their state rated relative to other states. Not just their institutions in a U.S. News and World Report ranking, but rather how states compared one to another on such important and increasingly important dimensions as affordability or access or... And the center did something I think very smart in the mid-2000s, which was to begin to publish a grade not of A or B or C or D or F, but of I, incomplete, in a dimension it created and called learning accountability. The question was, to paraphrase in a different venue, a different arena, and a former Secretary of Education, what do America's college graduates know and what are they able to do after 4 years of college? Not just are we graduating students, what does the throughput look like, what are the retention levels like, and not just efficiency considerations either, but rather what in fact do America's college students know and how can they demonstrate it, and how can institutions more critically demonstrate it in terms of the value they lend to institutions, not just degree completion, but an increased focus and emphasis on knowledge and skills and competencies. This focus today, a movement now, remember it's only been a decade in which we began really talking about outcomes-based accountability systems. But now I detect that we are moving even beyond the outcomes-based models to talk about what do students, what can they demonstrate, at what levels do they succeed, both through the college experience at various levels along the way, and what can they demonstrate as being their level of mastery of ideas, bodies of knowledge, skills, and competencies upon graduation. This will be a great turning point in American higher education and public higher education when states begin to focus in much more so than they have in the past on this question. When institutions are held accountable, and I know there have been movements in this state to think in these terms, but when institutions are held accountable, and by the way, this is, I'm speaking here conceptually and descriptively and historically, and I'd like to think, but maybe not empirically. This isn't a value statement, but when institutions are held to account over what their students can demonstrate as they're having learned and are able to do after 4 years of college, that's a pretty remarkable step in this accountability notion. It's been evolving very quickly over the past couple of decades, and I think it's upon us already. Finally, what of institutional distinctiveness and of mission differentiation? One of the concerns that I think many analysts and observers, and that I as well, share around the performance-based accountability frameworks that many states have been using is they seem to be focused on a very narrow conception of the public good and a very narrow conception of what it is that public higher education institutions ought to produce and what is their distinctive mission. I worry about the loss of mission distinctiveness and mission differentiation across the landscape of U.S. higher education. And let me skip down just to mention this other note around the fate of the research university, because I think these two are linked. A single-minded focus on college degree attainment, a single-minded focus on degree completion at public universities, particularly at public research universities, where I think the rub is felt the strongest today in many states, is, I think, a disservice to society, and it's a disservice to our systems of higher education. It's a disservice to our states. Our public research universities, of which there are, after all, only 140 in the nation out of 4,000 public colleges and universities, nonprofit institutions. There are only 140 of these critters, public research universities, and they share the lion's share of responsibility for the production of the scientific and technological knowledge, which is the basis for the knowledge economy of this 21st century, and they are largely responsible for the training of the next generation of scientists, scholars, and researchers that provide the intellectual infrastructure by which we will remain competitive as a nation and by which states remain competitive one to the other. The notion on producing more students and of graduating the students that we enroll is important, but it can't be the sole focus of state accountability systems. And I think increasingly in states there's a growing awareness that however eager states are to have those benefits come to them that redound from greater human capital production, more economic development, higher rates of economic activity, more diversified economic activity, higher income levels. All of those things that come from a state having a more educated workforce and a more educated citizenry, those are important, but there are other distinctive and, in fact, measurable outcomes of public research universities that I think are being lost in what is a fairly narrow construction of what accountability and performance-based accountability, the forms in which that's taken on in many states in recent years. There are confounding forces at work today such that the accountability systems of even a decade ago, the financially based performance accountability systems, I think, are in danger. It used to be that not that long ago, states had a little bit of extra money that they could try to induce or to try to incentivize institutional compliance with a greater emphasis on trying to accomplish one or another goal, such as the retention or graduation of students or certain kinds of students. Today, there are softer carrots. There is simply no money left on the table. There is less than there was before, even a few years ago, and there are harder sticks. We see this in the movement from Performance Funding 1.0, which suggested to institutions, if you will work harder to do these important things for the state, we will offer some additional money, some add-on money, to now system accountability frameworks that say, in effect, we don't have any more money to give you. We simply expect this as a part of your base performance. We're going to now determine your annual state subsidy, your appropriation, based upon how well you do the things that we used to financially incentivize you to do. So I think that performance funding accountability schemes are taking on a whole different hue, resulting in softer carrots and harder sticks. There's also a nationalization of state accountability policy. We see this, I think, in a variety of ways. Complete College America, the Gates Foundation, President Obama and the administration's focus on college degree attainment. These are all very important goals, but never before in the history of U.S. higher education have we had a powerful set of trans-state forces that have been able to help set the policy agendas of the states in the manner in which these outside state groups and forces are doing today. State accountability policy always was the domain, the idiosyncratic domain of individual states. And at best, states would learn from one another, perhaps, in idiosyncratic fashion. Today, there's clearly a movement toward a certain kind of accountability, and it has shifted the conversation from, as I mentioned earlier, one of inputs to outputs, one of a focus on institutional interests to what's in the state interests, but I would argue perhaps narrowly in some places, a too narrow focus simply on the production of more graduates or the retention of students as the primary fundaments of state accountability systems, whereas I think they need to be broader and they need to be more nuanced and more particularistic to the distinctive missions that different kinds of public institutions in this country serve. And let me finally just mention growing concerns over the politicizing of higher education governance at the campus system and state levels. Many of these things are things that I'm suggesting to you as observations that I and a number of others who work across the states are seeing. And I think there's a growing concern about this notion of the politicizing of higher education governance. The growing concern I would frame probably in these terms. In an increasing number of states, there is a concern that governors are using litmus tests and quid pro quo agreements whereby prospective appointments to state boards of higher education or prospective appointments to to public college and university boards are asked to pledge their allegiance to a particular policy agenda, or in fact, to pledge their vote to a particular matter that's to come before a particular board, in exchange for political support for appointment to that board. And I want to close today just on taking us a little bit back to the historical context with which we began. Accountability has clearly evolved into something very different than it was, both conceptually and in terms of practice, policy practice, just even a decade ago. But one venerable principle in American higher education, and a venerable principle of accountability policies and practices, subtle, if not always overt, was the idea of public university and public trusteeship. Public trusteeship has stood as an important principle underpinning good governance in American higher education for several centuries. And the notion here, of course, as you know, is that trustees represent the public's interest rather than the interests or the policy agenda of any one or several elected officials, and therefore trustees should be nominated and appointed on the basis of their knowledge, their expertise, and their capacity to demonstrate good independent judgment in behalf of the public's interest. In a growing number of states, there are concerns that perhaps this older model is now breaking down. It's understandable that in conclusion, it's understandable that in an era of very tight resources, of fiscal constraints of a kind that we've not faced ever before, that elected officials do have a responsibility to the public to elevate issues and to advocate for change in ways that they believe are responsive to the public's interest and preferences, including affordability, access, and completion in higher education. But there's a fine line between advocating a broad policy agenda and using the bully pulpits of states to pursue a particular policy trajectory, aim, or goal, and actually entering into these sort of quid pro quo agreements with trustees that they will serve the particularistic ends of a particular governor or legislature. And I know as I say that, and perhaps indeed here in this state, a state I know a fair amount about over a long period of time, this may seem naive to you, and yet I mention it because I think it's one of the fundamental aspects underpinning effective, good, and independent governance in higher education, and indeed the possibility and the prospects for a truly accountable public higher education system. Accountability conveys at the same time that there is independence. I and others fear that in some quarters in the country that public universities, particularly some research universities, may be losing their independence to act. And I think that is bad for American public higher education and a wrong turn in this evolving course of accountability, conflict, and debate and constructive change in U.S. higher education. So on that note, let me thank you, and if we have any time at all, David, I'm open to a question or two. Thank you.
This is really... why don't we do 2 questions now, and then if it's okay, Dr. McClendon, if I could ask you to join the panel, and we'll allow the panel to speak, and then we can open up to additional questions to you and the panelists. So do we have a question for Dr. McClendon right here?
You mentioned in talking about funding and shift in conversation, sort of bubbling outcomes, moving a little bit away from attainment and getting more into what are the skills that the students are actually learning from college. I'm wondering if you comment on how institutions or states
Dr. McClin, I'm going to have to repeat the question for the recording. So the question was basically, how can institutions and states go about attempting to measure learning outcomes?
There are several major kinds of initiatives underway across the states. There is a couple of ways to classify them. I'd say, you know, what many states are doing is trying to get at the notion of student mastery of what we used to call general education or liberal education. So what are the skills and competencies that underpin a liberally informed, liberally educated college student? This has to do with analytic reasoning and with a variety of other things along those lines. It is what an earlier era would have said is the purpose of general education, the first 2 years of college. Even as many national associations, indeed the leading advocates of liberal education in America, are arguing, and I think quite rightly and smartly so, that we ought to rethink the notion of liberal education. So it's not a portion of the general education curriculum. Rather, it has to do with competencies that are sown throughout the undergraduate student's experience across all 4 years and that build accumulatively. So in answer to your question, there are a number of efforts underway today. The Collegiate Learning Assessment, the CLA, there are other kinds of standardized exams that are being used to try to tap or assess how well college students have mastered these kinds of liberal education tendencies or attributes. There are a variety of other kinds of things going on in Oregon and a number of other states. There's efforts to kind of play with the idea of what the European Union has been doing around the tuning of curriculum. So groups of faculty and faculty leaders along with state officials are gathering, have been working together, collaborating around the idea of what is the necessary and appropriate standard or body of knowledge that a student in a certain field should have mastered. And then working from the back end of those outcomes to design and redesign curricula in colleges and to create certain kinds of assessments along the way that would help assess whether or not students are meeting that particular threshold. I'll say also there's a great deal of enthusiasm around the notion of electronic portfolios and the idea of portfolios as an alternative to standardized testing. I think there are a variety of different instruments by which states are going about doing this. Peter Ewell, the leading writer and I think thinker on this subject, is absolutely correct in my view when he says states have had a fitful experience with this. There have been lots of starts and stops. There's no one model that's caught on. And many states and many institutions within states that have used something like a CLA or other kinds of standardized approaches have in fact discontinued them over some period of time. So it's really difficult to determine what it is college students know and are able to do in any one of these areas across a sufficiently large number of institutions and over time to be able to say what's really going on. We just don't know that yet. But there are a variety of different instruments and assessments that are being used. And I mentioned in conclusion the notion of learning portfolios because I think it, in combination with other things, could help alleviate some of the concerns around the testing, what testing is a proposition, the conflict it tends to generate within some faculties, institutions, and publics. Did that get at your question? Thank you.
Right here. Is asking how do institutions like the University of Phoenix fit into the overall picture?
Yes, wonderful question. Are there any others? It's a great question. Well, I think in several ways. I think for-profit institutions and their willingness, and indeed essentially part of their marketing model, to indicate in advance what it is they believe students will be able to say they have learned after a certain educational experience. It's a separate debate over whether or not they're delivering that which they promise. But in some instances, I think the willingness of these institutions to be able to tell students precisely what they will be certified or able to do upon graduation has helped contributed undoubtedly to the rising chorus in many states of legislators who say, why can't our public institutions do this as well? This is, many legislators, this is just soft, right? I mean, we know you take them, we give you lots of resources to educate these people, and really, on the end of it, what do we know and what has happened to them? What has changed? What do they know? What can they do? What have they learned? And I think in many states, the response from public institutions has been not specific and has been not very good for a long time. So I think entering into this mix now is a new group of competitors, of institutional actors who I think are quite good, at least on the marketing side, of being able to say, we know quite well what our students will be able to do. So I think that's one way. I think it's a complex issue. The whole notion around preparing for occupations, specific occupations or vocations, is a difficult question and always has been for universities, and particularly for universities that, it's a very difficult issue for universities. And so I think the recent entrance of for-profit institutions, proprietary institutions, that sometimes take a very vocational or a kind of approach to education has also ratcheted up pressures in many states for institutions to answer the question from large swaths of the public, what will I be able to do with this degree? And also I think has sadly and negatively contributed to a misperception in some quarters that a college degree is not as valuable as it used to be. In fact, all the econometric data that just came out more recently, analyses that just came out recently, in fact, all of the econometric data and analyses that exist indicate that higher education and post-baccalaureate attainment is even more important than it used to be, and that the gaps between attainment and non-attainment, completion and non-completion, the returns on one's investment are growing over time, not diminishing. But the inability of universities, and this isn't a bad thing, but their unwillingness and inability to say for what specific jobs will you be prepared to enter into in 4 years, I think that's politically difficult for many public higher education institutions because of the times that we're in financially and budgetarily.
Okay, let's thank Dr. McClendon one more time. It's our pleasure to be joined by three very informed panelists who will they'll conclude our symposium today. Our first speaker is Dr. Lara Perez-Felkner, who is a new assistant professor in our Educational Leadership and Policy Department, specifically in the higher ed program, and she comes to us by way of the University of Chicago. We're also pleased to be joined by Dr. Bob Bradley, who is Florida State's Vice President for Planning and Programs and is also a professor of public administration and has had a distinguished career both in public service and also within the university. Our concluding panelist is Dr. Robert Brader, who is, we are very, very proud to say, an alum of our higher ed program back in 1970-something, too. Yeah, not 18. We're in the 1900s here. He's also, he's been the president of three different institutions and is presently the president of the College of DuPage in Illinois, which is one of the largest single-campus community colleges in the country. We're thrilled to have him with us. I understand he's been recognized by our Alumni Association, has been spending several days with us here, so we're thrilled to have him with us. With that, I'll turn the podium over to Lara.
Great, thank you. And my research focuses on social stratification and access and attainment in higher education. And in that way, I'm kind of an odd one out here on this panel and in this day because my work is not directly tied to higher education, finance, and accountability. And yet there are definitely clear implications, including, as we just heard in the most recent talk, for how the financing and accountability of standards influence participation in higher education and quality of the labor force, and also how interest in broadening participation, at least in NSF's terms, in higher education and in technical and scientific fields, specifically might shape our consideration, measurement, and evaluation of higher education financing and accountability. And right now, as we speak even, the U.S. Supreme Court is meeting to decide the merits of particular efforts to privilege diversity in admissions to selective institutions. Greta versus Bollinger, or the University of Michigan law case, ruled in 2003 that there's a compelling interest in diversity, specifically favoring underrepresented groups. So what is the status today of underrepresented groups? My analysis of nationally representative data from the Education Longitudinal Study of 2002 shows that among underrepresented minority students, Native Americans, Latinos, and African Americans specifically, about 75% aspire to a bachelor's degree or higher. Specifically, about 41% hope to earn a bachelor's degree, 17% a master's degree, and about 17% also a doctorate. And there are some nuanced differences within this category in that Latinos are more likely to have uncertain aspirations than African American youth, reporting that they didn't know how far they thought they were going to get. And young women in every subgroup breakdown, including white and Asian youth, have higher aspirations than young men in each category. But when we look at data on college completion, we can clearly see that fewer minority youth realize their aspirations than do white and Asian youth. In Census 2010 data, we see that while 30% of white and 54% of Asian individuals aged 25 and over complete 4 years of college, only 20% of African American and 14% of Latinos do the same. In the sciences, we see similar stratification as well. National Science Foundation data from 1966 through 2006 show that while certain science fields like biology and chemistry are witnessing a narrowing gender gap in participation, women's attainment of bachelor's degrees in physics, engineering, and computer science fields continues to hover at or about 20%, at or below 20%. And recent work that I and others have been engaged in show that clearly it's not because of academic ability. So sorry, Dr. Summers, but there seems to be something going on. These figures may not be troubling if we believe that diverse perspectives in the classroom and in the labor force and in the scientific laboratories are unimportant, but I suspect that most of us do believe that they are. And the present affirmative action case, Fisher versus University of Texas, focuses on the top 10% rule as a potentially unfair means to attain diversity. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with this policy, this refers to the policy that in the top 10%, that those in the top 10% of their high schools are guaranteed admission to the university, the state university of their choice. And I'm not going to weigh in on the merits of this program or any specific aspects of it, except to note that as we continue to see in my sociology of education class, and in extensive research since James Coleman's 1966 report on the equality of opportunity, college access is not just an individual and family issue, but secondary schools' roles in shaping the pathways of students into institutions of higher education cannot be understated. We're in a context of long-term and rising financial stress, not only in higher educational institutions, as Dr. Brenneman noted this morning, but also on families. It's especially important then to consider that if higher education institutions are tasked to train and develop a skilled and successful workforce, teaching them to think critically and to learn crucial social, emotional, and academic skills for later in life. And if we as institutions are tasked to include everyone in this enterprise, men, women, underrepresented minorities, disabled students, public school students, students from underserved and financially strapped urban and rural communities, then how do we weigh the merits of diversity in developing our models for financially sustainable and accessible education and hold ourselves accountable to these standards? And this was discussed briefly in the talk that we were just in. But especially, it's important to think about this as we increasingly shift into performance-based standards and a mind-blowing shift in what we define as higher education, including MOOCs, for-profits, online degree courses, and these new emerging forms of higher education are directly aiming, at least discursively, to serve the traditionally underserved and vulnerable, high aspiring but not necessarily high graduating student populations with varying rates of success in doing so. So state institutions like the University of California in the 1970s, the University of Michigan in the early 2000s, and the University of Texas presently have been taken to task on their methods of making public education accessible with respect to the use of race in admissions, reflecting on the discussions that we've had here today and on the emergent literature on finance and accountability. I suspect that we may see public institutions taken to task in the future on access with respect to the cost of higher education, or perhaps even the skills and debt that they do or do not leave with. In the marketplace model of higher education, this may indeed be the diversity and access conversation that holds our attention in the coming years. And I look forward to extensive discussion on the panel and afterwards about this. So thank you very much.
I'm going to stand over here. My name is Bob Bradley, and I listened to Michael's talk with great interest. I must admit it was thought-provoking and me angst-provoking because I think I've spent so much of my life working in this area and have done so many things in it. I've written legislation for turning the university into a charter university. I've written legislation to turn it into a private university. I've written performance funding laws. I wrote the state's current performance law 20-some years ago. I even wrote something called once ASAP, a seamless accountability plan, okay? So I've been in the accountability world, and when you get in that world, it is a term weighted with all sorts of baggage. The one thing you can't ever say is, I'm against accountability. You can't say that. You can't say it regardless of how stupid it is. Okay? Once upon a time, I gave a talk on accountability, and I traced it back. Who first started talking about it? I got back to James Madison. And you know, he had some good thoughts on it. But over time, I've come to just, it really just upsets me even to get into the accountability discussions anymore, because normally they're going everywhere at once. And so I have a different take on these errors. The error that you get up in, starting about in the late 80s up until now, I call it the age of magic, okay? It's magic policy. What is magic? If you're old like me and you took an anthropology course once, Malinowski, what is magic? Non-empirical means to empirical ends. In other words, you get to say whatever you want, and you don't have to say how you get there. That's what our public policy in a lot of these areas are. So people come up with elaborate accountability schemes where they're focusing on outcomes, outputs, throughputs. I've done it myself at length. But you don't ever have to say, how are we going to do it precisely? How much is it going to cost? And what are the implications of that for everything else you're doing? That doesn't have to happen. So, you know, Michael pointed out some of those problems in his talk, but they're very real and visceral to me. Because to me, as somebody in the university, I feel buried in accountability. We have an accountability, just outcomes on campus. It's rudimentary, very rudimentary. We have lots of people on campus working on it. It takes 1.4 million entries a year. It takes literally thousands of person hours. And in the accountability talk, never, ever have I heard anybody talk about the logistical demands and correlates of accountability. It doesn't happen. Just go out and do it. You know, just read. Just, I hate that, whatever the next word is, just. It's not just. You have to actually have some other things occurring after that just. And so that's been a difficult thing for me in a lot of these arguments. The just does not occur. Now, it used to be the case, once I have been a fan of Alan Schick, who's a congressional research analyst and has written a number of things on budgeting, and as you may have seen from my bio, I've been in budgeting a lot and written on a fair amount. But he had notions of budgeting that says, what do you do when you budget? What is the purpose of budgeting? It's not just to allocate resources. It's also to regulate the use of resources, control the use of resources, manage the use of resources, and plan the use of resources. So historically, you had very elaborate budgeting systems throughout the United States and at the federal level. They were all done by hand. Thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of paper, scores of person years putting together a budget. The budget that Florida had in the 1970s was enormously sophisticated, more sophisticated than anything we have right now. They had a schedule in that budget called the D3As. On the D3As were very elaborate performance measures, going down as far as you could go on how things were supposed to work. And every analyst was supposed to know all those things all the way down. And if you were putting the budget together as a legislator or as a policy analyst, you had to know those things all the way down, or you couldn't get the budget to balance. We began to move over to, it would take, in Florida, it would take 3 weeks just of typing to type the budget together. Okay, I'm hopeless. But the people doing that, they learned a whole lot about what was happening in places. They learned not only what was in the performance measures, but they learned other things about what was happening at that level. So the level of understanding was quite detailed and sophisticated. Now, as opposed to the weeks to put together a budget, literally, with the right set of analysts, you can get together a budget in an afternoon. You want to spend $70 billion? No problem. It can be done. Do you have to know anything? No. You don't have to know anything. All you have to do is know how to use the computer system. And it's almost like check budgeting. So, you know, you have these different tensions that Michael was talking about. He mentioned, for example, this notion of the production or the move away from state control to steering. We had John Osborne here in 1990 in Florida. He's one of the progenitors of the new public management, and his mantra at that time was less rowing, more steering. Okay, he also, and that sort of made sense to me, he also said that we were suffering under the weight of a bureaucracy run amok. Now that one I had a hard time with, because if it's the weight, how is it running amok? You know, it seems like it should be the weight of a bureaucracy anchored in place. Okay, but he talked about that particular phenomena then, but in the meantime, as we've had these decentralizing tendencies, in the meantime, the state, you have this rise of the state policyness, good word, or whatever you had a good word, huh? Yeah, it was a good word. I like that word. You had that state policy systemness. That was it. Good word. Where you're, that's the folks in the state have, at the same time they've been decentralizing, have been enormously centralizing. So actually, the number of regulations, the number of requests, the sheer welter of things that flow down under the guise of accountability is overpowering. At the same time, people are losing staff. They're having to devote more staff to just keeping abreast of things. Let's see. One, you made a whole series of good points. I felt compelled to comment on a couple of them. I think in Florida, one of the things that we suffer from is the lack of an industrial manufacturing base. And that's very significant for the economy, but it's very significant for the research universities. Who uses our research? Who even appreciates our research? Who knows what the heck we do? You can try to lay it out, but it's very hard. And if you ask somebody what course they were taking, he said, well, I'm taking this course in philosophy. And they say, well, what? Well, what did you study? Well, I studied Plato's Apology, and I read what Socrates said. And they will go, what, are you kidding me? How's that going to fit into the tourism industry? But actually, if you get into the apology, you'll see there's enormously important things in there. And if you ask the physics major, what precisely did you learn? Is it really going to be the case that on that competency test they're going to have him disaggregate Schrödinger's equation? I don't think so. That's not what they're talking about. When I got on one of the MOOCs here recently, I was looking at what does their differential geometry course look like. Great course, MIT, very sophisticated. The whole course, 20 PDFs that I could have gotten from a book in 1890. I mean, a very good course, but I could have gotten that book out of the library. So there, as MOOCs and these other things drive the cost of content to zero, the question that you asked of niche becomes increasingly important. How do you realize that in this new world, and how does that fit into these sorts of things that you're talking about? Obviously, I could go on, but, you know, that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I don't know if it's good to be the last one. I know one thing, that when I get asked to do something after dinner, I find that most people go to sleep within 15 minutes, so hopefully I can keep you awake for a short period of time. Dean, thanks very much for allowing me to come down and spend some time here. Last night when Wendy and I flew in and came in low over the city, she looked over me and said, "You look ashen." And I said, "God, he's made a mistake." And she said, "What do you mean he's made a mistake?" I said, "The pilot must have flown someplace other than Tallahassee." And she said, "Why do you say that?" I said, "It's too big." And then she said, "It's been 40 years. It's exactly right. I graduated from here 40 years ago in June, and this is my first time back, and I am delighted to be here and to be part of this. Presidents don't get the opportunity very often to attend functions like this and be able to hear from others and pick up good ideas and concepts that we can travel back home with and implement. So this is particularly good for me, and I thank you for that opportunity. It turns out to be a small world. I met your president earlier today, and I knew that I had met him someplace before when I was president of Penn College in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. He was the dean in one of the schools at Penn State University. So I recognized him, but didn't connect name, quite frankly, with his responsibility back then. And then I met Dr. Reiser earlier, who is your Associate Dean of Research and Planning. Turns out that we were both born in Queens, New York, seemingly 100 years ago, blocks from one another. He went to the higher end schools, I went to the lower end schools, but we still have a lot in common. And then I met Lou Bender earlier. He was one of my professors of higher ed when I was here in 1970. And then when I graduated in 72, he offered me the opportunity to help him set up the State and Regional Higher Education Center here at the university, which I gladly did. And he gave me the opportunity, frankly, to look at community colleges all across the United States. And that's when I got a real sense and appreciation for the diversity of the piece of the business that I have devoted my life to. So I'll take a bit of a different approach here, if I may, because looking more from a practitioner point of view, from somebody who's on the front line, who reads a lot of the things that have been spoken about today and listens to others who help develop the concepts and permeate them all across the country. But some of us then have to live with that and operationalize that. And I've been doing that for 44 years, if you can believe it, the last 32 as a president of one of 3 colleges. Just when they figure out that I'm not that good, I move on to the next one. And I think I'm running out of gas, quite frankly. I hope to be done here in 4 years and then figure out what I'm going to do with the second part of my life. I've worked in 4 states. I started out in New York State, which has one type of a system that's very governance-oriented, very central controlled. I worked for Florida, which is a coordinating board, as you know. I work now in Illinois, which is a coordinating board, and I worked in Pennsylvania, which has a nothing board. I don't mean nothing in the sense of nothing, but there is no board, and you heard about that earlier. Somebody would say to me, which do you prefer, New York with the governance control or the coordinating element, or would you prefer where there's no coordination whatsoever? And the first impulse is to say, give me Pennsylvania. Less government is better, less rules, less regulations, less unfunded mandates, less of all of that. The downside of it was, frankly, it contributes to the economic woes that exist in this country today in the sense that no control meant that the community colleges in that state, no different from the university centers, could do practically anything they wanted to do. So how many mortuary science programs do you need? How many nursing programs do you need? How many programs in automotive or any of the discipline fields we all offered? How many can you sustain economically coming in from federal and state money? And of course, that always raised a question for us. By the way, Williamsport Area Community College, where I started my first presidency, no longer exists, and I should like to refer to that in a moment. If you were to ask me as a practitioner what I see as the challenges facing the piece of the business I'm in, which is community college education, I would tell you 5 things. 1, governing boards. I referenced that earlier. I'm deeply concerned about the quality of governing boards, at least as they're connected to community colleges. If you ask me would I favor an elected board versus a appointed board, I think I would probably go on the side of appointed, but I'm not so sure. I currently have an elected board, 7 people, to run for the board seat in Illinois at the College of DuPage, which is a non-paying function. You better have between $25,000 and $75,000 to spend to get to that seat. And of the 7 board members I have right now, 3 were lifetime members of education, all supported by the IEA, NEA, funded to the tune of $100,000 to get elected to those seats for the sole purpose of being able to protect the contractual relationship that exists between that particular group and the institution. So I don't know which is a better way to go. Tenure is a great challenge. I think tenure is antiquated. I think tenure needs to move off the table. It needs to be replaced by something else. I know of only 2 professions in the country that have tenure, or one having the equivalent of tenure. We have it in education. The other one is a federal judgeship. Other than that, no other profession I know has tenure, and I think it's time we move that along. Underprepared students, K through 12, and I'm going to say some things today that hopefully will stimulate. K through 12 is broken in this country. It needs to be repaired. It needs to be fixed. 30% of the students who come to College of DuPage are single, double, or triple deficient, meaning they can't read, write, or compute at the 12th grade level, and every one of them has a certificate, a diploma, a competency credential from their high school. In other words, the high school has said you're ready to go to college. If you stay right here in the state of Florida and you travel down to Valencia, they've published statistics that show their developmental education is in excess of 50% of their student body. In Miami-Dade, it's even higher. And if you ask me what I spend a year on developmental education, it's a 7-figure number. If I could take those dollars and reapportion those dollars, I could hire 9, 10, 11, 12 full-time faculty as opposed to teaching what should have been taught in K through 12. Money is number 4 for me. It's not number 5. We've always wrestled with it for as long as I've been in the business, and we're going to continue to wrestle with it. And I'm going to say something that some of you probably disagree with. See, I think there's enough money coming into higher education. I just don't think it's distributed properly, and it's not spent wisely. And I think if we ever got a handle on that, we would find that the dollars and cents that we have, we can manage it very effectively, and we can continue to provide quality education. And the 5th one is competition from the private or from the for-profit private sector. That's the other thing that worries us a great deal, those of us in public higher education, because they don't even have a physical presence in your community. They come in by way of the computer. and they're in competition with us, and they compete for market share, and we need market share because that's where our dollars and cents come from, because it isn't the federal government and it isn't state government. So we're on to finance here. Let me drift over and make a few observations. I said earlier that higher education is a business. It is. It's big business in this country. Our core business is teaching and learning, and I think that if we don't practice good, solid business principles, we're not going to be in business very long. And I'll make an observation later if I might. I think we learn from the corporate world. I think we follow the corporate world by 15 to 20 years. So if you want to know what's going to happen in higher education, just take a peek at what's happened, for example, in banking. 20 years ago, banking looks a whole lot different than it does today. No one would have ever said there's only going to be a half a dozen major players in the banking world in this country, and that's about what's happened, quite frankly. If I then take you down, I said earlier about these 5 Ps, that's what drives College of DuPage: place, price, product, promotion, and people. And we move on all 5 fronts at the same time in order to be competitive in our environment. And Illinois has a lot of higher education. Chicagoland has a lot of competition. And if you're not out there successfully competing on a regular basis, you're going to lose market share, you're going to lose your standing, you're going to lose your money, and if you lose your money, you lose pretty much everything else because the rest of it just travels from there. In Illinois, if you think your state's challenged, come and visit Illinois. By far the worst economically performing state in the country. It even eclipses California. Moody's and Standard & Poor's gives us the same bond rating as California, but says for California they have a better opportunity to get themselves out of it than does the state of Illinois. We don't seem to have any desire to fix it, nor do we have any real means of being able to implement a strategy to go get that done. Let me tell you how bad it is. The operating deficit in Illinois right now, depending upon who you talk to, is between $12 and $14 billion. Unfunded pension exceeds $85 billion. The number is easily in excess of $100 billion worth of debt in the state of Illinois, and many people believe it's north of $150 billion. We have an A- bond rating, so we're getting close to junk bond status if it continues. And we have pension reform being talked about, where the state has dug the hole so big they want to send the obligation back to K through 12 and through higher education. And if they do, they'll send me a bill for $22 million next year on an operating budget of $165 million. That's serious money. And we would have to figure that out because the state's incapable of doing that. So if this was a private sector corporation, Illinois would be either Chapter 11 or on its way to Chapter 7. The only reason it doesn't get that status is because it's got what behind it? The taxpayer. Needs more money, it just cranks out more money and sends it out. They don't have to have it to spend it. But College of DuPage, even as it sits in this environment, if you will, one of the worst 4-year periods in our history back to the Great Depression, look what's happened at our place, if you will. We should get $54 million from the state. Last year I had a commitment of 12. They paid me 8. IOU'd me on 4. This year I should get 12. I haven't seen a payment. So the prognosis going forward is not very good. We've moved from an obligation legally of 1/3 of our operating costs to now under 4%. This recession for the last, and in that time frame, by the way, we have done $550 million worth of building improvements, and we've put $80 million in the bank. We've moved our reserves from under $40 million to north of $120 million during what many people regard as one of the worst recessions in the United States since the Great Depression. Now, if the state can be faltering as it is, if the federal government is unable to provide the support, how then can College of DuPage go ahead, strengthen its financial position, and I be able to say to you or to anybody who works at the institution, we issue 4,000 W-2s, you don't have to worry about dollars and cents. If you want to do something, we can do it. You just have to have a good rationale, a good reason why we ought to move in that direction. If an unforeseen circumstance materializes, we can take care of it. If an opportunity presents itself, we can go after it. We have the capacity to react. We don't have to worry, frankly, whether we have the money to do that. And we have weaned ourselves of the state of Illinois. I know that that's not money that I can count on any longer, And quite frankly, I wrote the Senate Pro Tem recently and said, if you'll keep your $6 million and take away all the rules and regulations and all the stuff that you make us comply with, that's a fair trade. Leave me alone. I'll go quasi-private, and you'll never hear from me again. She never wrote me back, so I don't know what the implications of that might be. So how did we do that? And I'll do this real quick if I can. We renegotiated all of our employment contracts. You have any idea what it's like to go in and negotiate contracts that have been Christmas treed for 20 years with benefits and other things of that nature that literally we couldn't support any longer? So we had to go in. We also brought all of our employment contracts to bear in 1 year, so we negotiated all in 1 year. That helped us with our economic performance, because then you don't negotiate 1 year with one group, 1 year with another group who says you gave them this, you gave them that, why don't we get this? They're of greater value. So bring them all to bear in 1 year and treat everybody alike in terms of percentage of income to the salary pool and Tier 1 benefits. That saved us millions of dollars, if you will. We realigned our staffing patterns, so just because you had something for 10 years didn't mean you were going to keep it. We looked at the institution holistically. We brought people from one area to another. We just realigned. We put the emphasis where the institution currently is and where we see ourselves going long term. Obviously, comprehensive planning. We eliminated underperforming students. I certainly am sensitive to what the President said earlier about the program he had in petroleum and in gas. At the same time, we're like a Walmart in community colleges. We have 240 program offerings. They're coming and going off the shelf all the time in order for us to be able to meet the needs and expectations of the community that created us. So when we get an underperforming program and we can't tweak it to make it relevant, to make it viable, to make a contribution to the institution, we make the difficult decision to take it off the shelf and replace it with something else. We subcontract out services, so no longer do we do the bookstore, no longer do we do the food operation, but rather we get big fees from those people who like to do that. That's their center of excellence. We don't have the overhead connected to it. It becomes a profit margin for us. We increase, we heard this earlier, out-of-district students. You talk in terms of Florida, the university talked about out-of-state students. We now have 10.5% of our student population from out of the district. We like that because they do what? They pay 2/3 of the tuition. We don't have to worry about the state giving us 1/3 of the tuition because they don't what? Give us 1/3 of the tuition. Increase in philanthropy. It was always the purview of a university community or four-year institutions. Now community colleges are in it in a big way. We have a very active foundation. So I'm out raising money, maybe not as much as the president of Florida State, but it seems to consume 1/3 of my time as well. And we pursue grants with much more vigor than we ever did before, and that supplements the revenue that we're not getting, again, from Springfield or from Washington. We heard earlier about the concept of differential tuition. We have it. We have very expensive health career programs. It costs much more to educate a nursing student than it does to educate somebody with a bachelor's degree in philosophy or psychology or history or government. And so now we charge differential tuition. We charge twice the level of tuition for health care or cardiac care or any of those programs because they're so costly for us to deliver. We've now implemented a concept called 3+1s. Florida, I think, is the most progressive system of higher education in the country, bar none. We would like to emulate much of what's being done down here. Illinois isn't quite that progressive. So now we have 3+1s, where we teach the first 3 years of a baccalaureate degree, the fourth year by a partner university, discounted at 40%. We now offer 10 baccalaureate degrees for under $32,000 a year, all in. NIU is almost 25, 26, 27,000. U of I is over 30,000. What do you think that does for market share? They just come running to the door now, and that's good for us because we get the third year of tuition plus the discounting, and it makes us look very attractive in terms of the community. We accentuate business solutions. We heard the comment earlier about working more with the private sector, with manufacturing. We do a lot of that. We're accentuating that. We just got a grant from Washington with a bunch of other community colleges for $12 million to work in the manufacturing sector. If we do that right, it has spin-off benefits. We'll grab revenue. It'll again support the revenue we're not getting from the state. We capitalize on auxiliary services. So we have, not quite like Florida State, but we have the MAC, which is a performing arts center. We have WDCB, the only jazz radio station in Chicagoland. We have the Inn at Water's Edge. We have Waterleaf Restaurant. Every one of those now are used to be able to promote the core business of teaching and learning. They just don't sit there and function independent of the institution holistically. And we tell the story. You know, the film we all watched, If You Build It, They Will Come. Community colleges had that attitude for over 100 years, beginning with Joliet Junior College. That's no longer enough. You have to tell the story. You have to tell it effectively. You have to be able to compete in a marketplace where there's an awful lot of competition, not only from the other community colleges, but from the other providers. And let me make an observation that some of you may or may not agree with. See, I think recessions, call it what you will, are a good thing once in a while. It forces you to prioritize. It forces you to go up in the attic and clean out. It forces you to make difficult decisions. It happens in the natural environment. Nature takes care of it by sometimes putting inflictions in place that cause things to adjust itself. And so while I wouldn't want this to go on much longer, 4 years is enough. I do think what it has done is it's forced all of us who have paid attention to the environment to make these difficult, critical decisions that we normally would not do. One other observation, when I was in Pennsylvania at Penn College, this was 15 years ago, our tuition was north of $225 a credit hour as a community college. I can remember when I left Florida State in 1972, Virginia was worried about $13 a credit hour. We were $225 in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, not the epicenter for cultural, social, and economic life in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And yet we grew enrollment from then 3,000 to well over 5,000. At that cost, people would travel to Williamsport because we had what they wanted, and it was of a quality nature. See, I happen to believe in that kind of an enterprise. If you have what people want and you offer it in the way that they want it, when they want it, how they want it, you'll grab your market share and you'll be able to sustain yourself long term. 3 or 4 predictions, and I'll sit down, because presidents can run on forever. Because back home inside the institution, it's a captive audience. They can't leave because they all think they're on film, and that later on somebody's going to be able to say, see, I knew I shouldn't have left when he was only 45 minutes into it. I predict sometime before 2025, you're not going to see much support for public higher education in this country. States are incrementally going to go bankrupt. They can't support it. They're going to focus on K through 12, and I may be all by myself here, and in 2025, I am long retired. I will never see any of you, so I'll never have to really atone for any of this. So watch the funding for higher ed. It's leaving. It's left in Illinois. It's going to be on its way throughout the country. I think there's going to be fewer players. So if there are 1,100 community colleges, if there are 1,800 plus providers of higher ed, watch what happens over the next 10 to 15 years. There's going to be fewer of us. In 1981, I went to Williamsport Area Community College. In 1989, we effected the only merger of its kind in the United States when Williamsport Area Community College merged with Penn State University, became the Pennsylvania College of Technology, a wholly owned subsidiary corporation of the Corporation for Penn State University, allowed me to do baccalaureate degrees. In 3 years, we brought on 22 baccalaureate programs, enrolling 20% of our population, and that, more than anything, sustained the institution going forward. Mergers and acquisitions, common to private sector business, will eventually happen more frequently in our business because many of the providers can't find a niche market to be able to survive long term. I mentioned earlier about tenure. It's going to be replaced with something else. I understand the importance of job security, but I think tenure has lived its life and needs to be replaced with something else. Performance-based education is coming, but I will tell you the gestation period for what we ultimately implement will be many times longer than that for an elephant. There's going to be a lot of chewing and consideration going on. It is in Illinois, and you want to hear how funny this is? If the Illinois legislature gave us the money they should, $350 million, you know how much money they're talking about to incent us to do performance-based education in 48 community colleges? $750,000. Why would I chase that? Why would I chase that? It's going to take them forever to come up with something, but they're going to have to come up with it because, again, we go back knowing full well that that's what the taxpayer expects. And community colleges, my piece of it, will expand their mission and will also sharpen its focus. I think what Florida's done with community colleges being offered baccalaureate degrees was brilliant, brilliant. And it's permeating the country, not yet in Illinois. It will happen for us as well. At the same time, we're not going to be able to support everything that we've been supporting for the last 100 years. We're going to have to make choices. We're going to become more focused. We're no longer going to be able to be all things to all people. That may sound like it's a contradiction, but the point is we'll expand and we'll constrict both as we redefine ourselves. I wish I could tell you or spend a half an hour talking to you about shared governance and the terms customer, client, return on investment, return on assets, the business terms that I use every day. One of the speakers this morning said that that's common practice. It may be, but I have to tell you, I haven't met very many faculty at my institution that like to hear customer, client, return on investment, or any of those kinds of terms like that. And yet I think they're very applicable for us. Thanks very much. Enjoyed it.
We'd like to thank the panelists, and we have time for a few questions. So you shout them out, and I'll repeat them. And right here.
Election year, we've got candidates coming to our door or inviting us to their parties. What's our elevator speech to get them to fund higher education?
So what's the elevator speech to policymakers to fund higher education?
I don't know what the elevated speech is, but somebody said this morning that the President of the United States, the current President, has really brought a focus on community colleges, and he has. The tragedy is that with all the conversation, there's no sum and substance to back it up. In other words, all the billions that they're saying that they're going to earmark for community colleges, not $1 has flowed yet. So eventually, if you feel strongly about economic development, if you feel strongly about graduating more people, especially in the technical fields, the occupational fields, where the jobs are in this country going forward, then you've got to put your money on the table, and that hasn't happened yet.
Any of the other panelists? Okay. Another question. Yes.
And this is for President Bruce. My question is, you talked about the reserve that you've been able to build up. Is that at risk at all from being swept from the state, or have you truly gotten out from under regulation?
The question
Yeah,
is
the state can't, I'm sorry.
the question is the reserve that President Bruder's built up, is that at risk because he's holding on to that money?
It's not at risk other than the fact that the state wants to now send back to community colleges and K through 12 expenses that they have been responsible for years, like pension contributions. I don't know that we shouldn't have been paying the pension contribution for our employees all the way from the beginning, but we haven't. Now, in order to get themselves out of this $85 billion hole, they're going to assume the obligation of the current debt, but to stop contributing to it, send the local responsibility back, or send the responsibility back to us. If they did that to us in one full year, it's $22 million. I doubt that they would do that. I doubt the public would allow them to do that. So they'll give us the chance to absorb it, and we've been setting money aside the last 2 years in anticipation of it.
Okay. Why don't we, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to, is it Carol? Carol's question about what the elevator speech might be. I don't know fully the answer to that question, but I will say that I want to return to a comment I made earlier and also a thread that may have been pervasive in my remarks. There are a few functions of the university, as the President reminded us, more important than teaching and learning at the undergraduate level. So the production of baccalaureate degree holders, the production of associate degree holders, the production of greater human capital, it's critical. And I think that's essential to our making a stronger case, and we must make a stronger case than ever before in terms of our contribution to economic development. In part, what I'm responding to today, and the reason why I make the remarks around performance accountability systems, is that sometimes they seem that they are hammers, or they're instruments that are a little too dull for the complexity of the problem at hand. And I think there's a real crisis in the public research university today. I'm glad that we've had this sort of exchange from representatives of different kinds of institutions, different types of institutions, and I've learned a lot. I will say, studying public research universities, I believe there's a crisis at hand. And the crisis isn't foremost one of funding, although that ain't good. And the crisis isn't that we've had changed political leadership in the states, and often that's been to our disadvantage. I think the crisis in part is that we have been ineffective as an industry, we've been ineffective as a sector. And I think there's also widespread confusion as to the public purposes of research universities. They do not exist for the purpose, as some critics assert, they do not exist for the purpose of insulating faculty from good, hard, honest undergraduate work. Part of their existence, part of their mission, this manifold mission of the public research university, historically and today, is to contribute to economic growth and to contribute to a knowledge economy, to contribute research and development and technology, and to serve as the R&D infrastructure, the spine of a country, in which those kinds of functions really aren't handled anywhere else in society or in our economy. And that's the crisis we face, I think, that the public doesn't fully understand the core purposes, the multiple purposes of a public research university. It must do better, we must do better in educating undergraduates and seeing them through on their way toward graduation and beyond. But we also have to make a much better pitch, Carol, here's my answer, have to make a much better pitch than we have in the past about the essential research function that we perform that no other sector of American higher education performs. And the value of that to society, to the economy, and to Americans, I think we've not done very good at that. We've got to do a much better job in the future.
I think that's a great note to end on. So we'll thank the panelists and invite Dean Driscoll to close it out.
Well, this has been quite a day, I think. And this is the part that I always have great difficulty with, because I've thought about so many different things, I've heard about so many different things, and I really would like the luxury of being able to think about it a little bit before I actually have to make some pithy concluding comments. So I just will make a couple of observations as we close out today. I think that we've raised probably as many questions as we've answered. We've talked about some very broad issues related not only, or affecting not only Research One institutions, but community colleges and every other sector of education today. And it's a complex landscape. I think there's no question about that. I think solutions are multifaceted. We heard that as a common theme throughout. And there's probably lots of places that we can look for potential solutions. We've heard more than once to resist silver bullet solutions, even though they seem to be politically expedient. And it's always disheartening to think about, particularly in a state like Florida, where we do have term limits, that our legislators are not so interested in the long term, but in the short term, which tends to make them even more susceptible to the short-term silver bullet type solutions. It seems to me, and I've heard this theme reflected a few times, that there's a real opportunity for perverse incentives. I thought that was quite a wonderful term, and unintended consequences of policies. But that, to me, just sort of reinforced the notion that we have a lot to learn from the various sectors. And President Bruder talked about the business sector as one area that we should look at and think about in terms of the business of higher education. I heard during one of the breaks, somebody commenting, "Wow, this is so depressing." And we have heard a lot of things that might be cause for depression, I suppose, but that's not my nature, and so I'm absolutely determined that we're going to end on a positive note. And there are positive things, I think. And a couple that I would say is that certainly from an academic perspective, we have a lot to work on. And that's a good thing, I think. I mean, we have a lot to do. We have a lot of different kinds of problems to work on. You've heard a whole variety of different kinds of perspectives, and there's still a lot of work to do. So that's a good thing. I think the second good thing for me is that, and it came out just at the very end again of the panel, we have to help our public officials and our citizenry understand what the heck we do. And so to me, one of the positives coming out of that is that suggests a theme for next year's symposium. We're always looking for good topics, but consistently this fall, and that some of the the meetings that I've attended have really focused on the utilization of research in public policy and how we help our public officials better understand the work that we do in research and how it can be informative and helpful to them as public officials. And so that may, in fact, be something that we would potentially look at next year. So I want to just thank all of the folks who participated, all of you who are here today, taking your time. I think we've had a very interesting and thoughtful and provocative day. I invite you to continue conversations with our speakers at our reception, which is, again, over in the University Center Club, which is the sixth floor in University Center C. Don't ever ask me for directions, that's clear. But there will be plenty of us headed over there. Please do come and join us, and thank you all so much for coming.